So, Nadja, over to yourself.
Hey, thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you to Sarah and Rose and also to Ollie for inviting me to come and speak today. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some of my work with many of you in all different corners of the world, and I'm really great that we can still connect in the uncertain times in which we find ourselves at the moment. So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference here in Vancouver, and one of the keynote speakers got up, and he was a CEO of a major mining company, and he made a really profound statement, which was that he said mining companies are not only in the business of mining, but they're also in the business of water. And for those of us who work in water, you know, this was a great thing to hear from someone so senior, but it also speaks to just how important water is becoming at all different levels of the organization. And so some follow-up work that company Goldcore had been doing on the amount of water that the company was moving relative to how much ore they were moving was really substantial. And as you can see from that first kind of quote that I've got there, you know, in some cases at some of their operations, they were moving up to 15 times the volume of water as what they were ore. So clearly the importance of being good water managers is very, very important in the business of mining. And in areas that are more water scarce, we also have different kinds of water problems. And I like to think that no matter which mine you visit in the world, there's going to be some kind of water problem, whether that's quantity in terms of shortage, whether that's flooding, or if it's quality issues or other. And as the quote there on the bottom right is also highlighting, you know, water-related infrastructure can in some cases be a very, very significant part of capital expenditure for some projects. And so the importance of water is clearly something that is very much top of mind for a number of companies. But in more recent years, I've been very lucky to be engaging with a lot of excellent colleagues, including Jocelyn Fraser, who works in stakeholder engagement. And this work has kind of exposed me to the different ways that we can think about water-related risks from the perspective of different actors. And so a lot of my work has kind of started to broaden beyond just thinking about company water risk to thinking about how risk is perceived differently by different people. And a couple of years ago, a lady called Diana Kemp and some of her colleagues at the University of Queensland published an excellent paper where they were talking about the way in which the word social risk is becoming conflated in mining. And so whether we're talking about social risk from the perspective of communities or from the perspective of a company, the word social risk can have different meanings. And I would argue that it's very similar when we think about water. So we can think about water risk from the perspective of a mining project, and the pictures on the left there highlight some of the different ways that water risks can pose impacts to production. So whether that be through flooding, like the billion-dollar production losses that happened several years ago in Queensland, or issues associated with water quality and flotation and how that needs to be actively managed. On the right-hand side, though, of course, we have water risks to people and to community and to environment associated with mining's use of water. So we think of issues like water quality, acid rock drainage causing a lot of legacy issues for projects, and of course the health impacts that can happen in relation to the interaction that happens between people and between water in mining, and that particular picture is from artisanal mining, of course. And when we think about the large-scale mining sector and the relationship that companies have with social issues around water, where we look at incidents of social conflict, actually water is very often right at the center of that. And as you can see from that picture down the bottom, you know, this can sometimes erupt in very violent conflict. And so the potential for water-related issues to really rebound to a company can be really substantial. And so I think when we think about water, we really do need to be cognizant of the different ways in which we can think about those impacts. And this slide I know is very busy, so don't panic. It's a lot of data there, but I really just wanted to highlight some of the key trends that these charts show. And this is some really interesting work that was done by some Australian researchers who were looking at Australian data, but they found very similar things from a lot of studies in other parts of the world. And so the picture on the left-hand side is showing that average ore grades are declining in many different parts of the world, and particularly for many different commodities. And that's probably not a surprise to many of us who are working in the mining sector. But the picture in the middle also highlights that as we start to have lower ore grades, and as we move to the left-hand side of that figure, we can see that the water consumption is going up per tonne of product. So as we're mining lower ore grades, grades, unless we have significant changes in the way that we're processing ore and that we're producing ore, we're also going to result in an increase in water consumption and energy consumption as well for the amount of product that we're producing. And of course, if we're mining lower ore grades, that also means we have to dig a lot more rock out in order to produce our product. And as a consequence of that, and as you can see from the right-hand side, we are also going to be generating more waste. So both in terms of waste rock, but also in terms of tailings. So these images are really just to highlight that water issues will by all intents, be likely to get more challenging as we move forward. And that's part of the reason why I think we really need to be very, cognizant of the ways in which water issues are addressed, and also the close relationship between water and waste is another area of interest for me in particular. So I hold a research chair at UBC, and my research, I kind of have been thinking about it in two dimensions. I hold half of my appointment in the School of Mining Engineering, and in the work that I do in that realm, I would say is mainly focused on the risks to mining projects. So the left-hand side there, working at the engineering and the business interface, and I'll give some examples of what I mean when I talk about that in terms of understanding how we can mitigate the ways in which water can pose a risk to mining business and operations. But on the right-hand side, I'm also really interested in how we think about water issues within regions, what water issues can arise for people and for communities, for ecosystems that are located within regions where we have mining. And so that part of my research, I have another hat where I have half of my appointment in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. And so I feel very privileged to be working in this very interdisciplinary world at a university. And so that's been really great to expose me to different ways of thinking about these issues and when we think about water in particular. And increasing as my work's evolved, I've also started to realize that actually there's other kinds of actors that are thinking about water. So like investors, how do they see risks to portfolios? And that's an evolving area of work, which I'll also touch on briefly today. 10 minutes goes very quickly, by the way, so I'll just be giving you a high-level summary of things that hopefully will spark your interest to follow up with me. And so my research team is really international. It's interdisciplinary. As you'll see from the picture, we work in all different parts of the world. And whenever I'm doing a project in another country, I always endeavour to have a student from that country as well. And we have in particular been doing a lot of really exciting work in Mongolia in recent years, which I can talk more about in the question time. But as you can see, we have a lot of interest in Latin America as well. And so when I started my work in this space and when I first went to work in water and mining about 15 years ago, one of the things that really struck me when I was visiting a lot of mine sites is that not all of them would necessarily have a water balance. And we've seen that improve substantially in recent years. And I think, on account of a lot of the water-related effects that a lot of mining companies faced, there's much more recognition of the need to manage a water balance and to have good water accounting practices. And a lot of the work that's been led from the Mineral Council of Australia and ICMM has led to a lot of improvements in the way water reporting happens. And we certainly see increasingly when I visit sites, I anticipate that they will have some kind of water balance. But one of the things that I've been doing in a lot of my work with mining projects is to actually make sure that we're able to communicate information about risk to different levels of the organisation. And often what can happen sometimes with water is because it's kind of not always prioritised until it's really critical, unfortunately, which means that we really need to develop models that can speak to higher levels of management and explain why we need to have really strong water management practices. So a lot of the models I've developed in my previous work have been really focused on having this systems level view of water to communicate what those risks, particularly around water quantity, look like. And as I'm moving this work forward, I've just got a new PhD student, Benjamin Cox, who has a background in finance, and we'll be doing a lot of work also looking at how to put a financial value on some of the technologies you might implement in order to improve water management. And so that's really really important for getting the right attention of the right person to make investments in water. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight on this picture is on the right-hand side. This was some work I did in my PhD where I was looking at social networks to look at who people talk to about water. And it was really fascinating to me. We know that there's a lot of operational silos at a lot of sites, but when I went to actually map this out for a case study, it was really striking when we came back with these network maps, which really highlighted how divided some of the communication can be around water. So this picture shows dots with each individual represented by a circle. The size of the dot is the level in the organisation. And what you can see is that between the two largest production departments, they're not communicating with one another about water. And groups like health and safety were the ones in the middle that play a really important role in bridging that communication. So this is just to kind of touch on how some of my research in the past has kind of touched on these risks to projects, and I have a lot of ongoing work in this space, including with another student of mine, Alice, who'll be continuing to build on some of this previous work. Another area of work that we've been focusing on is also thinking about risk to people. And I mentioned that I've had some really great collaborators who are much more experienced in stakeholder engagement and community engagement than I am. And that's been a fascinating learning experience for me. But one of the things we've been endeavoring to do in some recent work is how do we actually get engineers to think about risks to people and communities in the way that they're doing their decision making. And so this particular project that I've highlighted here is also with some collaborators from the University of Queensland, and they had a model that was looking in the Chilean context around how to optimize infrastructure for different mines that were located in inland regions of Chile. And as many of you who may know a little bit about Chilean mining is that a lot of the mines are up in the Atacama in the mountains. So in some cases, and it's actually being encouraged actively for companies to be using desalinated water for mining projects, which means that water is being pumped from the sea up to the mountains at a very high energy cost. So there's been some really interesting work done on the water and energy trade-offs around that. But what's less well studied is the ways in which communities are also impacted by this desalination infrastructure. And so what we've been doing is taking that model that's looked at water and energy trade-offs and thinking, how can we actually also incorporate community impacts and community costs into the way we do our modelling? So that's another key area of work that we've been doing in recent times. And then just finally to touch on, because I know that I'm probably running out of time, as I said, I am also becoming aware that there are other actors that have an interest in thinking about risk from their perspective. And so I have a new PhD student, Sally, who's been working with me for the last year. And one of the things that's happened recently around tailings, and of course tailings and water are very closely connected, which I'm happy to expand more on. But this call for transparency around tailings management in particular has been really very influential in recent times and very clear. So many of you will have heard about the Church of England and other investors coming together to encourage more transparency around tailings data. What she's actually done in the early stages of her research was to do interviews with investors to better understand how they feel they play a role in reducing tailings risk, and also what they need in terms of information to make better decisions. And she did a series of interviews with investors in the early stages of her research, and what she found is that a lot of these initiatives like the tailings disclosure request, they have a lot of positive benefits, but at the same time, there are investors that aren't quite sure how they're going to use that data for information. So the next stage of her research is now looking at how we can model a lot of those tailings locations to develop tools that may be helpful for investors to better understand risk exposure. And so we have some really interesting collaborations with our Earth Science group who have some very funky models that we're working with to look at what the consequences of failure events could be. And then we'll also be aiming to get at likelihood quantification going forward. So in summary, and just to wrap up, I just wanted to highlight, you know, that as I've gone on this journey of mined water over my career, I've certainly become to appreciate that when we think about water risk, we really need to have different lenses, because there are many different actors that consider this term and they think of it very differently. Water risks are growing. I would say that we need to have increased attention and ongoing attention to water issues. And finally, that I really do feel an interdisciplinary approach is so important for looking at water issues. And I'm incredibly grateful to the wonderful team of students that I work with. As I said, I've only touched extremely briefly on some of our work today. I encourage you to get in touch. We also, just a little advertisement, Benjamin and I, he actually initiated a mineral processing economics course, which we've been running online for the last several weeks. So if anyone's interested, connect with me on LinkedIn and I can share the details with you. But thank you so much, and I'll stop sharing my screen now so that we can come back to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nadja. So round of applause from our sides of the microphones, and you will see all of the other people on video there all applauding you as well. That was brilliant. And yes, please, with regards to sharing the details to your course, I'm sure there'll be lots of people who will be interested in that. Now, there has been a plethora of comments and questions. There's been a massive debate whilst you were talking around stakeholder.
Okay.
As well as, of course, people talking about water as a whole. And I think before we go to some of those questions, was there something that you wanted to talk about with regards to your team in Mongolia and what they were doing? Because you skipped through them really fast.
I did. I just touched. Well, actually, I guess I was thinking about it because we've actually been working over the last kind of 2 or 3 years with an early stage exploration project operating in Mongolia. And so my colleague Jocelyn has been focusing more on the stakeholder engagement piece, actually, and thinking about the role of exploration in the early stages. So we've got some reports that that we can share on that. I'm happy to kind of flick them on. I'll add a link in the chat there. But also in terms of water, I think we really need to consider the kind of the role of early stage exploration in making good decisions about water, because water issues are, you know, the way that we make decisions on water very early has a lot of implications for other stages of the mine life cycle as well. So I think thinking about the dependencies between stages of life is really important in relation to water.
Yeah, and this is something I know that, so we've got Norman Gridley speaking later on today, and in a previous life he was in charge of sustainability and risk management for Quellaveco, so one of the big copper mining projects in Peru. That was one of the key risks there was, of course, water, because it's in a very dry part of the world. But with that, so I guess many of the risks that we think about is the availability or the access to water. But what about the quality of water? And this builds on some of the information that Pierre from the Responsible Mining Foundation shared with us on Monday, where lots of people focus on, is there water there? But then actually trying to delve into all of those aspects of the quality of the water is a bit more difficult. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think issues, it's interesting because I do see, you know, well, I always like to tell my students, it doesn't matter where in the world you go, there's going to be a water problem. No matter which mine you visit, there'll be some kind of water issue. And so scarcity is one that I think is really top of mind. We think about security of supply, but actually, you know, I've seen some really interesting presentations from companies that will say, you know, it's not about scarcity for us. The majority of sites actually have flooding risk. For us, it's more about managing the volumes of water. And so, and from communities, a lot of communities may be more worried about the legacy impacts around water and the water quality issues around mining than what they necessarily, you know, so their perception of risk can be very different as well. So I do think we need to think a bit broader when we think about what we mean by water risk. And it's certainly not just about scarcity risk at all. The other thing I'll say, and it's another area of work that another one of my students, Gabrielle, is working on is, and he's actually from Peru. So he's very interested in mines located in mountainous areas and what the impacts of climate change will pose on people and ecosystems around those projects. So I think, you know, the impacts of climate change are another dimension to this, which will kind of intensify a lot of those challenges for mining as well. And quality plays very much into that in terms of legacy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nadja. And we've just had a new question that's come in from Christopher, and he's asking, have you looked at tailings and water recycling at all?
Tailings and water recycling together. So I suppose, you know, a lot of, like, so I'm not a geotechnical tailings person. There are people that focus on that. But certainly in terms of tailings being a key area for opportunity in terms of water savings, absolutely. And a lot of the risks that, tailings failure events, for example, water excess water in a tailings dam can be one of several triggers that can lead to failures. So there's a very close relationship between the way that you manage water on a site and what that means in terms of tailings risk. And also the thinking about where there are opportunities to save water. Very often the water that, often a lot of sites, particularly mines that I've worked with in the Australian context, when we looked at their water balances, the water opportunities to save water by recycling from tailings are often the biggest opportunity. So once water goes to tailings, the only place it goes is up or down. So it either gets entrained in the waste or it gets evaporated. And so that's kind of lost water. So from the perspective of trying to save water and recycle more water, tailings is a huge opportunity. So technologies to recycle water from tailings can also be extremely important to think about, particularly for sites in water scarce areas. But as I said, because of the risks of storing too much water and potential flooding, I would say that we still also need to have attention to water management, even if we're in wet areas as well.
Brilliant. And one more question that we will squeeze in here for you. And this comes through from Andy. And Andy's asking, he says, he's very interested in your network diagrams, and asks, how do we address challenges if organizations don't talk to each other? Are there some really basic things that need to be put in place here?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think I might have to, I know Andy well, I might have to follow up with him on that one. I think there are, the whole space of how to break down silos is really key, and it's a big topic. So, to give, I guess the easiest, to give a very quick answer, I would say we do need to think about the role that brokers play in communication, trying to position people in strategic ways to promote communication. I think sometimes we undervalue the role that these facilitators can play in making sure communication flows within organizations. There are very good reasons why we have departments. They have a lot of important functions for ensuring people can get their work done, but we also really need to value brokers. We need to value people that can cross those silos also.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yes, his question is in the Q&A, so feel free to answer him with some more in-depth details, and the rest of us can all see those as well. So brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Round of applause from all of us around the world.